If this woman could speak to you, I have a feeling she would tell you to seek adventure and follow your passions. She definitely did. Ruth was born over 200 years ago in 1813 to John and Orlinda Lucas. Her dad was one of the first settlers to this area and ran a store in the 1790s on what is today Route 20, and in that store is where Ruth grew up. Around 1834, she met a man who was preaching at their church named Miles Bronson, and before long, the two fell in love. Her father, John, however, was furious at the idea of them being married because he knew that being a missionary's wife would be incredibly hard on his daughter. He told Miles he would rather bury his Ruth than permit her to go with him overseas. Almost immediately after this conversation, Ruth became incredibly sick, and fearing that she would soon die, her father prayed that if she would be spared, he'd allow them to be married. Ruth recovered and became Mrs. Miles Bronson on April 28, 1836, at the age of 23. Shortly after exchanging vows, Ruth and Miles headed to Assam, India, a trip that took them 6 months, and they lived with the Montague tribe. When they arrived, Miles got to work preaching while Ruth opened a school. She was there when a plant known as Camellia sinensis, a tea tree, was discovered and began being shipped all over the world. Ruth gave birth to 8 children, but only 6 would survive infancy, and by 1846, 6 years after arriving, the Bronsons decided it would be better for their children to receive their education in the United States, so they returned home. Unfortunately, their daughter Frances was too ill to travel and passed away before they left. While they knew their kids would have an easier life in the U.S., Ruth and Miles also knew that being missionaries was their calling, so they made arrangements for the kids to stay with family, and they returned to India. Life became even harder for Ruth. She missed her children greatly. The natives pushed back during colonial rule, and the East India Company was forced out. It was incredibly hot, dangerous, and with very little safe drinking water. Ruth, among many others, became very sick in 1868. The Bronsons rushed back to the United States for her to be treated by hydrotherapy in Elmira, New York, but it was not to be, and she passed away on September 30th, 1869. She was brought back and buried beside her father in Madison. Her husband Miles remarried and returned to India with his new wife and his and Ruth's daughter Mary, but both women would die of Asiatic cholera a short time later. Miles is buried in Eaton Rapids, Michigan beside his third wife, and he served as a missionary for a total of 43 years. Last year, I was contacted by a member of the Montague tribe in India asking if I had any information about Ruth and Miles. The tribe still had many of their writings, which according to him are an immense contribution to their society. It's nice to know she isn't just remembered in our tiny town. Every time I stand by her stone, Ruth reminds me not to be afraid to do the scary things, because she sure wasn't.